Hello and welcome to the Cardiff Met Sports Coaching Hub podcast.
I'm Ollie Lamb.
And I'm Mike Castle.
We're here to bring you insights around all of the latest cutting-edge research within coach education and practice.
You can stay up to date with all of our latest episodes through the links in the podcast description below.
We hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome back to the Cardiff Met Sports Coaching Hub. I'm once again joined by Professor Robyn Jones, and our normal director, Manuel Santos, has stepped into the recording studio today to talk about some of his own work. So, Manuel, how does it feel to be on the other side of the mic?
It feels like I shouldn't be here. I should be sitting with Alex on the other side of the studio.
That's what we like you to feel uncomfortable, don't we? So, how are you both? All good?
Yes, all good. Thank you.
Fine, thank you, Ollie.
Good. Okay. Today we're going to be talking about your paper, which is currently under review. Is that correct?
It's under second review at the moment, yes.
Okay. Under second review with who?
Sports Education Society.
Okay. And it's around developing creative coaches through action research, why and how context matters. Firstly, I just wanted to chat about kind of the origins of the paper. So I believe this came from your PhD thesis, Manuel, but what was the kind of driving force behind the idea in the first place?
Yeah, so as you said, the paper comes from my doctoral thesis. I think that the focus on creativity started in the DSC in your module, where we had some conversations about critical thinking, about change, about creativity. Then we had this a session only focused on creativity, on collaborative creativity and jazz and coaching, which led me then to pursue some of those ideas in the action research module of the DSC. So that's where my interest in creativity started on. I only figured out later that you had some curiosity in creativity I didn't know about then.
Yes.
You had a project penned, something like that. You had some ideas written somewhere about creativity in coaching.
Yeah, there was an interest. I think it's an epistemological interest in being anti-orthodox. And so thinking a little bit so-called outside the box, thinking in a different way about things, and that leads you into literature and notions of imagination and creativity. So that's where I think you're referring to. I tried to apply for a grant that would work with others in terms of their creativity.
Okay.
Which I think was rejected about 4 times, and therefore it really hasn't seen the light of day. But it's led to something else, which is how these things often happen.
Okay. What is creativity? I appreciate that's a loaded question, and we're going to chat about it throughout the podcast. But in terms of what should people know who are listening about it before we kind of delve into the aims of the study and the findings themselves?
You're right. It's a difficult one. For the purpose of this study, the definition of creativity that we went with is 2012 Runco and Jaeger's standard definition of creativity. The way that they explain it is that an idea is deemed creative if novel and appropriate to the context. So I think there's 2 things to be said here. The first one is we for the purpose of this study, my thesis, we employed this definition of creativity. We needed a workable definition of creativity to work with coaches. But we also knew at the same time that it's not consensual. It's one that raises a lot of questions about, what does it mean to be new? If for something to be new, do we need to be constantly reinventing the wheel? And at the same time, who defines what is appropriate, and how do we agree on the appropriateness of something in a certain time and space? So while the starting point to define creativity was here, but at the same time, we knew that this was like a contested definition of creativity.
Yeah, just expanding on that, really. Yeah, what Manuel was referring to is, yes, Runco and Jaeger's definition, which they claim, yes, novelty, but they also claim it has to be somehow kind of useful to the context or to the practice. So it's not enough that it's new, like in and of itself. Yeah. It's got to be of use. So in lots of ways, the way it's been written at the moment, creativity is a very elusive idea. And some have used it in all sorts of ways, and some have attached some assumptions and heaven-sent myths. For example, that it's always a good thing, that if you can sit in a space nice and quietly long enough, you'll be hit by a bolt from the blue, and you realize something. That it's only realizable through talented individuals. It's not for everybody. So it's a very elusive idea, and that not really even looking at what's the objective here. Is it to work with a creativity, or is it to work for a creativity? So it's quite elusive.
I'll add then. Yeah, so one of the problems with working with with creativity is all the preconceived ideas that come with it. So adding to what you just said now, that only in certain fields we are expected to be creative, like in music and arts, that those are the creative people, and in research, in a research field, people are expected to be creative or to have some creative agency, which you are I see you as someone who's very creative, so I don't think that, case in point, that's just a myth. But I also think that it's a word that it's thrown around very easily, and at the same time with very little concern about what exactly does that mean, and what exactly do we want, as you were saying, that we all heard someone say at some point that that we got to think outside the box to be creative. Yeah, but which box are we talking about here? Where's the box? And what exactly does that mean? And I think one of the first things that we wrote in the thesis was that it's a very popular concept and idea. It's looked for in a range of fields, yet we don't know exactly what that means. But it's present everywhere. It's appreciated by all, but we don't know exactly what it means. But besides, thinking outside of the box, or if an activity is fun, then it's a creative activity. Or, maybe I might be giving away a bit too much here, but the coaches usually see creativity as a hands-off approach. What does that mean exactly then? That for someone to be creative, we as coaches should not do much. So I think, long story short, that it is contested and difficult to pinpoint and explain what is creativity. And for all these reasons, and going back to the first thing I said, that we kind of embrace this idea of the standard definition of creativity, knowing of all of these caveats and contested nature of the concept.
Leading to the aims of the paper then, and I know there's kind of a theoretical strand to this around creativity, and also a methodological strand around action research. Was one of the aims, or kind of the wider thoughts around it, to not redefine creativity, but perhaps reduce some of that contestedness?
I think it was to bring it into the realms of realism, like a little bit more as well. As Manuel's hinted at very, very strongly, it's traditionally, in these later years, it's been thought of as an individual attribute. you are creative or you are not so creative. And so it's an individual responsibility. So it's from a kind of psychological viewpoint very, very often, a cognitive viewpoint, which as we know, especially within our sphere, you have coaching, you are not allowed, the environment, the history, the kind of situation won't allow you to do everything that you may want to do. There are certain roles one has to occupy, like etc. It's not to say that you have to act in accordance with these things all the time. There's always space for agency, but there's a certain under recognition, appreciation that one acts within a social environment. Now, there is some early research in the sociology of creativity that actually gives some sort of recognition to the environment, to social context, but they don't really explain what they mean by that and which features of the environment. So one of the aims of the article was to, I guess, kind of firstly see what kind of influence, like if any, that the social environment really was having, like over individuals' attempts to implement ideas related to imaginative practice and creative practice, but also what were the specific kind of factors that enabled or maybe kind of hindered their adoption of it, so within the work settings.
One of the objectives that we wrote in the thesis was the exploration of tensions between structure and agency in the quest of creative practice. So hinting at what you meant here.
But I was going to say, like in that respect, obviously that the work is grounded in something. And so it's grounded in our belief that goes along with the main themes of the podcast, that really that there is agency and structure here at play in virtually all sorts of kind of human action and practice. And so that was a virtual kind of starting for us. And there's enough work out there that actually says this. Yeah, so that was one of the aims, to explore what were really the agential factors, what were the kind of structural factors that both restricted and enabled this adoption of new and novel ways of doing things.
You got anything you want to add on that, Manuel? Or?
No, I don't think so. I think the second part of your question was about
potentially redefining creativity.
I think before starting the paper, as I said, we were well aware about the messy nature of creativity, the struggles in defining the concept, and therefore the struggles in making sense of what does it mean, or what's the process like of acting and creating a novel, an original idea. So there was an element of there for sure about to try to pinpoint the process of creativity, of trying to bring further clarity to it.
For sure. And in terms of kind of contextualizing creativity in that way, you decided to use action research as the methodology. Was this around getting coaches to be creative, or around getting them to encourage their players, athletes to be creative, or was it a bit of both?
It was the former. It's coaching with, as opposed to for, your creativity.
And that was kind of adverse to what a lot of the literature had done before, right?
Yes.
Yes, but this is some of the lack of clarity that Manuel referred to here. This is some of the elusiveness that these kind of things are not particularly made explicit, really, when you read about them. And the fact that it's automatically thought of as being a good thing. Well, sometimes it doesn't have to be a good thing. And so our work was about trying to explore, I guess, kind of the different ways to to give the same message or slightly different messages along similar themes. It wasn't to swing in between A and Z and B and K. It was to try to get coaches to kind of think about their job in maybe a new way, which would enhance the engagements of the athletes. Okay, the goal would remain the same, but this would be like another way of engagement, a more interested way.
And let's talk about action research then. Why action research, and kind of how did that unfold?
So action research, we know of its potential to bring change in a given context. So the potential of action research to create change at a local level with the individuals that work in a given context was a design that that was close to this idea of creativity and to bring novel ideas and potentially creative ideas into life. And therefore, that was one of the reasons of why action research was the design chosen.
I think it goes along with what Manuel wanted for his work as well. Step in here, Manuel, of course, but it seems as if you've always been more interested in trying to alter practice than just to understand practice. Now, action research has the elements of understanding, which is the research aspect, but it also, and importantly, has the action aspect, which is to try to influence someone's work and practice.
I think and maybe talking a bit more in detail about what I did in the study. I think the way that we organized the study, where I was working with coaches and supporting them to think creatively, was something that was very appealing to me, for sure. This idea of acting as an educator, and enacting this role of the educator and working closely with coaches and actually having the opportunity of doing something that we barely have a chance to do with the work that we do with the undergrads, which is to go and observe and spend time with people. The marrying of the action with the research was something that was very, again, appealing, and that I looking back at the too many years that took me to complete the thesis, that was definitely the most enjoyable part. Being in the field and working with coaches and observing and interviewing them and deconstructing the things that they were doing in their practice was definitely quite enjoyable, and one of the reasons why we went with this.
I think some of the sources as well goes to annoyance and frustration, and also to experience. If we think about the experience bit, we kind of know already that it takes a while to alter, like anyone's practice. To run 4, 5, 6 workshop-y sort of sessions is not enough. They may be very, very enjoyable, but the legacy is just not there. And of course, we know this. And so there was annoyance about that we need to do something. Okay, it's the experience that we knew we had to do more, but there was annoyance also, like in relation to the way that action research has been written up. There's a number of what we considered really as quite naive assumptions that you find within the literature of action research. And so this wonderful idea of working with and trying to change the practice for the better, etc., has been somehow derailed, but by not engaging with the real politic, I guess, of issues on the ground. So we needed to look under kind of some of these assumptions of action research as well. So we had the elusiveness of creativity. We had the elusiveness of action research. So it wasn't an easy thing to get a clarity about as such, but it was worthwhile trying to understand and to get a better version of both, basically, at the same time.
Yeah, I clearly remember the conversations in the DSC room about action research, and we were having these conversations about technical, practical, and emancipatory action research, and then collaborative and participatory. And I think from
first and second and third person.
First, second, third person. And I felt a bit frustrated about this because for me, it always seemed a bit of an oversimplification of what we would be trying to be doing in this project. And yeah, just building up on what you're saying, Robyn, then I think that what this rosy idea of action research being collaborative and democratic excludes the inevitable power differences that exist in any educative context. So it's something that I think we try to make it as clear as possible in the paper, in the critique to the design, that this idea of being learner-centered or athlete-centered, it is a very how should I put it? I think it's it has a very noble intent, but at the same time, it is hindering, and it's almost like putting aside these power differences that must exist in the learning context.
And was that aim of kind of advancing, critiquing, challenging action research, was that something that came as a kind of a reflective experience of the difficulties, challenges of action research, or was that something that was an aim from the outset of doing the project?
It was an aim from the outset. It wasn't as if we first of all just made a decision, okay, we're going to do this and this is how we're going to do it. And obviously we had an idea about action research would be something, okay, that Manuel was very interested and wanted to use, but it didn't lead either. So it's as if these two dual themes of the work, which were united really within the work itself, they kind of nudged each other along, like in many ways. But the critique of action research that we engaged in was not meant really as a destructive kind of deconstruction of action research. In actual fact, we're advocates of action research, but not of the naive assumptions that have somehow gone along with it. So I would say that we are, realist as opposed to idealist advocates of action research, where there's no space beyond power and authority. Not everybody is always equal in the same room at the same time. This idea that participants can ideally and expertly act as researchers, really all at once. This kind of, opposition to any external knowledge force into the environment, that there's enough knowledge within the room already. Well, of course, you don't know what you don't know. It doesn't acknowledge these sorts of things. And yes, that was where that we wanted to actually explore it. And therefore, we present a version at the end of action research, which we think is more realistic and therefore more useful.
Can I ask you one thing then? I'm on the first cohort of students at the DSC. Yeah. And these conversations that we're having here about action research is one that I don't remember having in the classroom. Was that also the case that your views of action research have in the meantime changed?
Yes, I think that's probably true. I don't think my frustration regarding it changed. It was what I was reading about it, which I clarified, my thoughts about it, really. Mm-hmm. So, as with all new readings, as with all something that, that you come to actually realize that you can put a label on it. You can put a name, you can put an idea on it. So the more one expands knowledge that way, clearer one's thoughts can actually crystallize. So I think like over the years, yes, undoubtedly, and perhaps reading some of Van Manen's critique and Wedekind's critique, who I had an email exchange with, so further made one think that this is not a critique against action research. It's against the idealistic representation of action research, which doesn't really work. But we wanted to make it work because we believe in the idea.
I think the fact that you have so many students, they've done their doctoral thesis using an action research design, I think that says a lot about how we see action research within the school. The two of us being an example of that we're critical of this idealized, a very clean depiction of action research that we just simply jump from one cycle to the next without any bump on the road. We're critical of some of the literature that represents it like that, but that doesn't mean that we have, as you said, a stance against it. It's with the purpose of making it better and tangible and workable.
Yeah, I think some of the difficulties I had with it was that it's not to disrespect the participants in any ways, but somehow they can't see, like, outside the context, but because they're inherently involved in it. And so the assumption that they know, I guess that they always know, sometimes they do know undoubtedly, but that they always know, okay, this is the issue, this is the problem. There's no engagement with the sociological, I guess, imagination here, that actually it's not this that's the problem, it's kind of something else. There's a kind of structural problem here. It's not an individual one. And of course, if you don't have that, if you don't think in those ways and don't have the ideas according to the sociological imagination, you can't do it. And this is not to always say that an external mentor, action researcher, facilitator is always right.
Yeah.
But they can bring something else. This is the external some knowledge that I don't think is particularly respected enough within a collaborative action research in particular, which is not the same as the original version, but by Lewin, which was more about social science theory as it works in practice, if it's in a school, if it's a health authority, if it's a sports club, whatever that is.
Yeah, and this goes back quite nicely to your idea of creativity, in that actually if the coaches or the people you're working with can't see outside of their own environment, how are they expected to be creative?
Yeah. Are we moving on to the findings?
Can we stay on the methodology, but maybe you've mentioned kind of the issues with kind of presenting it in a clean way, but perhaps you could talk us through maybe how it did flow from one cycle to the next, or what the main aims of kind of these cycles were. Like, what were you actually trying to do with these coaches?
Okay, so for context, I was working with 4 head coaches, 4 different sports. So within each cycle, I would bring a new idea for those coaches to work with. And this was introduced in a focus group with the 4 coaches. So for instance, the first cycle was about defining creativity, and we had conversations about the standard definition of creativity. So then after that focus group, each coach would be observed at least once. After each observation, we will do an individual interview where, we will have conversations about some of the things that I observed, some of the things that they thought or some of their thoughts about what they did. And then the cycle would be concluded by a new focus group which will then ignite the second cycle. So the first cycle was about defining creativity. The second about educating coaches about the proportion model of creativity, and this is where it started. The bumps on the road started, maybe even earlier than that. It started about the reluctance of coaches to change, and how much they appreciated this idea of being creative. They valued the idea of creativity. They wanted to see it in their athletes, yet they were very reluctant to bring some meaningful change to their own practice. So cycle 3, we spoke a bit about rule breaking as a mean to bring new creative ideas to life. And in the 4th cycle, we spoke about taking risks and how creativity involves some sort of risk-taking and how they could potentially cope with that.
Okay, the length of the study was over 4 months.
Yes.
Yes, because I think that's an important thing to actually realize. That Manuel virtually lived in and out with them, with this group of 4 who were willing, very willing participants. They wanted to be a part of this and they believed in the idea of creativity. So he lived them and he followed them and discussed with them, observed them and deconstructed for 4 months. I just want to add that.
And maybe there's one more point to be said here. So 4 head coaches, relatively well experienced coaches, highly qualified coaches, not only in terms of NGB's coaching qualifications, but also level 7, level 8 students in coaching. So these are individuals that have a very, developed knowledge of the field and of the context. They are critical, yet the underpinning finding and theme across these 4 cycles was the reluctance to change. There are some changes.
Yeah, which is ironic in a way, because one of the reasons why Manuel selected them and why they selected themselves was they did have a degree of authority, over the selection.
Yeah,
they've really run their own exercises and sessions. So they did have a degree of autonomy, quite a high degree of autonomy, because that was obviously something that, that was needed within our sample, because, it would have been far too easy to actually hide behind, or, I'm an assistant, I'm not allowed to do such stuff. They did have space to do this stuff.
Yeah, let's chat about that first kind of finding as it's listed in the paper then, the nature and scope of change. Could you kind of expand upon what that kind of section is about?
Okay, so a few examples of how there was some change, right? So there was a focus group, and we revisit several times during the cycles the proportion model of creativity, which are some ideas and concepts of how to think creatively. So we saw some creative ideas, some that we reported in the paper, some that we couldn't leave it in, we couldn't put them in. So, for instance, these idea of on a tennis session using a table on the court to be used as a platform for the ball to bounce back. There was something in one of the hockey sessions about using a bin to replace the goalie, or use 2 goals, one inside the other, to make it a bit more challenging for the attackers to score. There was also some things about changing how to provide feedback and the nature and the content of that feedback. Now, these are interesting, right? I think this says something about the potential of this proportion model of creativity to enact some change. But these are just, cosmetic, superficial changes. I think.
If I can rewind a little bit there, Manuel, to look at the first cycle, because there was a misuse or a misunderstanding of what creativity actually was. Now, this goes to something that we were exploring earlier about that if you sit and discuss, with interested individuals enough that they will get the understanding. So even though the Manuel sat and discussed what is creativity as far as you're concerned in a wider context and in your context, there was just an inability to actually kind of frame it in a way they could get the novelty, like as Manuel's already said, so through these actions of etc. But they couldn't really marry the novelty and the usefulness into the action. So there was also a misunderstanding of it, which led to what we called, I guess, really the misuse of it, because they could not get that understanding kind of through the discussion at the focus group, without the external influence of, here is something to play with. And that's where the second idea of introducing the propulsion model as more of a structure, that's when that was done in response to this misuse and misunderstanding.
The point that I was going to make next was that it was about the type of change.
I jumped the gun there, Manuel.
Please interrupt me every single time, Robyn. The only point that I was going to make next is about the type of change that we wanted to see in the coaches, was to have something more meaningful and therefore appropriate to the context that the coaches are in, that speaks to the effectiveness criteria. Something that actually, something that was, aligned with what Sternberg called the paradigm defining ideas, more than just these cosmetic changes, superficial changes to coaches' practices.
Mm-hmm. Talk to me about this kind of model of creativity, because is that not a bit of an oxymoron in itself, perhaps?
Well, action research is defined as, and this is something we fundamentally agree with, that there's an emergent quality. So even though that you do have structure, that that you go within these kind of cycles of action, reflection, etc., really there is an emergent aspect to it. And what this really means is that you make decisions on the basis of what you see and what you find at the end of the first cycle, in terms of, this is what I will do for the second cycle in order to change the practice in a positive way, which is the aim of the work always. So really kind of seeing this inability to understand and the misuse of ideas of creativity that were really evident within the first cycle. Manuel decided, let me give more structure here. Let me give more guidance, because that wasn't evident in the first cycle. So hence, he introduced a particular, kind of framework. It was a model, in order that they could kind of hang some kind of a practice, some kind of a marked idea, marked space, so they could go away and experiment with this then in their practice. And so that was the idea behind it, to give more structure to the practice.
We don't like the M word, do we?
It's a word. I guess we can reclaim it. It's a model as such. It's a framework. It gives some structure. That's what it does. It gives some structure to think with. That's what the plan was, because of the inability to actually think in a consistent manner.
One of the values of it is that it gives a few ideas. It suggests a few ideas on how to think creatively. Mm. The authors call it a model. It's what we extracted from it. I think it has 9 or 10 concepts we extracted 4 of them on how to think creatively that were introduced to the coaches. You said I decided. I would say we decided because you were critical friends, acquaintances.
Very critical friend.
So what we did then was to decide to make a decision about these 4 concepts that we introduced to the coaches are the most suitable for the context we're in. So in a sporting field. So for instance, there's this idea of redefinition. So reuse an object or an idea with a different purpose that was its original one.
And what was the result of this for the coaches? What did you see in practice as a result of kind of giving them more of a framework, more structure?
I'm afraid that I'm repeating myself, but some of it was this option to engage with the model in a way that it provided some superficial cosmetic changes to their practice. Okay, so again, the example of the table for the ball to bounce back, changing a bit the nature of the feedback that was provided more than in-depth engagement with their own practice. And I think one of the things that we didn't see in coaches was an engagement with the reasons why they do the things that they do, which was something that we were hoping to get to. And whilst we didn't see that, I think that also speaks to the uncertain nature of coaching, that it's difficult already as it is. It's difficult already if you follow the rules and you do as you're told and you copy the structures and the models that are given to you by the coaches above you for you to run your practice, or you have someone else making decisions for you in terms of team selection. It's already difficult as it is. So I think that on the one hand, I remember, and I think I told you this at some point, Robyn, how I was somehow disappointed as I was writing the findings that we didn't see more than these cosmetic, superficial changes. On the other hand, I think that it says a lot about the nature of our role as coaches.
I think it goes to the nature of action research as well, because I do remember that in conversation. I had to buy Manuel about 4 coffees to calm him down, which usually takes him the other way, but this time it was to calm him down.
That says a lot about me and coffee as well.
Yeah, but it goes to, because we knew that we had about sort of 4 months, maybe 4 or 5 months of a window of work here in order to somehow alter and change the practice in the way, for the better. So we weren't seeing that change. And we were approaching, halfway through. So we then decided, okay, let's see if we can, force the change and give even more structure here, because there was still some confusion, some discussion. Thought the discussions were a bit circular, not really going anywhere. So we decided then, at the start of the third focus group, even though they had a framework, they had the propulsion model, that wasn't enough. So then we made them focus on, okay, well, what do you usually do? Okay, so we gave them something of a recognition, consciousness of what they did. Okay, now can you relegate that and try to bring something else into your practice? Not something oppositional, but something that would help really accelerate the developments and complement the developments. So we gave them some particular, a firmer framework again to do things with. What we found in response was that they did the first bit, they identified what they usually did, and then they went straight to the opposite. I I guess because it was easy, because you can identify the opposite of what one does. So if they did blue, if they usually did a blue thing, now they would do a red thing. So for example, I think, again, just going to step in, Manuel, that we had one coach who used to give a lot of kind of feedback, I guess, who enjoyed that aspect of it, liked to give a lot of feedback, really thought that was his role to give a lot of feedback. And this time, he gave no feedback. He didn't give less feedback or give feedback in a different way, using different words. He didn't give any feedback. So he went from one extreme to the other because he couldn't think in a different way about how can I think imaginatively about not doing the same thing all the time. He was just unable to get at the imaginative and creative thought process apart from, okay, I'll do the opposite. And he wasn't the only one. I think the 3 out of the 4 were quite extreme examples of doing opposite behaviors, which they thought were creative.
Yeah, similar examples was one of the coaches. He was very adamant that most of the feedback and the structure of their practices was around game-based approaches and game-like scenarios. So what he did was to just resort to just a fundamentally technically focused session. I think the clear example is this example that Robyn just shared about the coach that went from, providing feedback and being active to the session to the exact opposite from not only not providing feedback, but actually I remember seeing him in the session with arms crossed and this almost like annoyed look on his face. And I'm sure that I wrote somewhere in my notes that I was from the observations that the athletes were a little bit confused about why is he acting weird today? What's happening here? Why is he doing this? So it goes back to this idea of confusion of what does it mean to be creative.
I think allied with that, Manuel, as well as the confusion, there was an inability to think in a creative way, even though they had definitions. We had definitions of what creativity was. We went back to Runco and Jaeger, etc. Yeah. But they couldn't think in that way.
But I would say, though, that before them being able to think creatively, they should have known better first. What does it mean to be creative? So that's why we started with the standard definition of creativity, defining what is creativity, and then think about the process. What does it mean to be creative? And I think that opting to not provide any feedback, doing the opposite of what they usually do, I think it reveals a misunderstanding of what does it mean to be creative.
I think one of the interesting things when we asked about this and explored this a bit more, I think all 4 actually, they went to a default role, even though they did have agency within their roles, which is why they were selected and why they wanted to be part of the project. I can't emphasize that enough. They went to a default kind of justification that I'm not allowed because there's kind of someone above me, or this is the ethos of the club, or that we have a major game on Saturday, which I need to win, so I can't experiment, or that there were always these contextual environmental reasons, which we wrote about why they thought they weren't able to actually act in more creative, imaginative ways. In lots of ways, it was just too risky for them. And maybe there's enough risk in the job anyway. We all know it's a complex job with uncertainty and ambiguity attached to it. And maybe that's enough. And we were asking them to be even more uncertain, even more risky, which again was that unrealistic on our part to actually engage them with this in the first place? Because that's something that we've asked really of ourselves, and we're writing something about now, like in a book chapter.
I think then the final point to make here, I think, just to add upon this idea of uncertainty, is that from the moment that we ask them to do something different, it also changed how... We're also asking them to change how they see themselves, also asking them to change their perception of selves as coaches. Like, that the coach who decided to say very little during practice, they see themselves as, an engaging, constructivist coach. And the moment that we're asking them to do something that to stop doing the things that they usually do, it was almost like a threat to the way they perceive themselves. We're asking them to almost reshape their identity as a coach, which in itself, it is, it's obviously very difficult, but it also highlights these idea and around uncertainty about coaches' practice.
I think it also goes to, we opened up with, often within the kind of sociology of a creativity, that a reason to given for why or why not is something to do with the social environment. That's a factor that has to be factored in the context. But they don't go any further than that. They don't go. So this was one of the features that we defined that actually this makes up that. It makes up the context, i.e. a sense of identity. So we were asking them to somewhat reshape their identity, albeit within 4 months. You think it's a long time for research. Perhaps it ain't. So that maybe is unrealistic of action researchers who think they can change things within 4 or 5 months. You are really, you're engaging with someone's history and biography, sense of identity, sense of achievement, and asking them to alter it. It's very, very difficult to do that. And these were some of the features that makes up what we defined as the social environment and context.
And it's interesting that I'm hearing you to say that, Robyn, and I'm thinking that it also says a lot about how do we need to think about action research in order to promote those changes. That we need to engage with this contextual features, the biographies of the individuals in the context, the features of the context, the history, educate individuals within that context, educate coaches about them, for them to be able to bring change and to fulfill this potential of action research to bring change to any given context. One that, 99.9% of the definitions of action research contain these ideas that it's about bringing change in a context. So I think one of the findings here then is that if we want action research to fulfill this potential, then we need to make sure that we educate the individuals within the context about the power structures and the micro-political landscape of the context to be able to bring some change in it.
But this is not to say that there's no agency. There is always agency. I think we need to, as a ways forward, I think we need to better engage with what Mead really wrote as the me and the I. Okay, the me is the kind of social identity, in many ways, that this is who we are, this is what we behave like, we have to act like a coach. I've developed my identity along these lines. Really, but the I then is much more about the individual implanting his or her identity into that. And so that's where the imagination starts to really kind of fly, if you like. And so it's to emphasize that, whilst never trying to isolate the individual away from the environment, because you can't, it's to emphasize, well, you can be somebody different, or you can think in slightly different ways, use different languages, different metaphors, I guess different ways of engaging others. It doesn't have to be the opposite to what one does, because that just won't work. But it's not to undervalue really the individual and the agency in here. And this is what gives the action research a power like in and of itself. You can do this. You can do some of this. Once you do some of it, then everything else alters. You can do some more or not, as the case may be, to reach the end goal which you've decided upon. So the change in itself is neither good nor bad. It depends how close you get to the goal that you want to get to. And that's important too.
Manuel, I just want to ask you a question about kind of your feelings throughout this process. You mentioned, and Robyn mentioned, obviously having to buy those coffees, you being uncomfortable maybe with the lack of change or the cosmetic changes that you were seeing. At what point did you become comfortable with the change that you had managed to kind of have, or in the value of the work in general?
Can the answer be that I've never became comfortable with it? Because, one of the things that we haven't
Were your expectations unrealistic then?
Maybe they were. But one of the things that we haven't spoken about today is the things that I did or that I didn't do. It was my role to educate individuals about creativity and to support them in bringing all this change and all that stuff. So you were just talking about agency, that individuals do have agency to promote change, which they do. But if they didn't, then it also says something about the things that I didn't do to support them to enact change. So I think that the frustrations about the lack of change were quite evident. I felt very frustrated about it, but it's not frustrating. I think this is the coach in me, that I'm not frustrated on my athletes. I'm frustrated about the things that I'm not doing for my athletes to become better, or what else should I be doing for them to be able to attain this aim of being a bit more savvy and thinking creatively. I'm not sure if I answer your question, Ollie, but the frustration is still there.
Mm.
But I don't think, I'm reasonably sure, Tim Manuel, that there wasn't a resistance on behalf of the coaches to change here. There was no active resistance. It was more of it was an inability to critically think about the social forces that make up the context that they work in, and what they were able to do, why they were able to do that, and when they were able to do it. I think that was it. There was no, I'm not going to do this, Manuel. It's too far for me to. Not really. They just weren't able to think in a way that actually I can work in this way as opposed to that, whilst factoring in the whole social force of context.
Agreed. Obviously agreed. But the fact, what I don't think that I've done enough was to fulfill this role of more knowledgeable other, to help them understand how to reach from point A to point B in this alternative, appropriate, novel, potentially more effective way of doing things. And for them to be able to do that, then I'll have to make them better aware about the structures that are in place, and make them aware that in fact they do have agency, and to challenge them to see the agency that they in fact had, rather than just looking at it in the write-up of the thesis and thinking, I should have done a bit more.
So what you're advocating is a more active role for the action researcher here.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah.
But in having those difficulties, you've drawn out some of the issues or critique of action research that have been a strength of the paper, or kind of value of the paper itself, right?
Yes. Yeah, I hope that is one of the intentions of the paper, especially when we write about the critique to AR. And again, it is having we should be having the difficult conversations with the participants, which speaks to the things that we're talking about before, about that we in an action research design, we are not at the same level of the participants. It's not 100% collaborative. The participants in the study will not have the same role that I have as a researcher, precisely because of this. Because I need to have the space and even some sort of authority to call people out to help them make sense of, in this case, the agency that they in fact had, but they couldn't see it or opted to not enact.
I think it also goes to the heart of how we think we educate coaches, maybe educate others as well. Because when you're trying to educate someone, you're trying to change the way they think and the way they act, if it's in their work settings or whatever. So in order for that to happen, it really kind of highlights, kind of some of the issues, I guess the strength of history and biography and identity, what can be realistically expected over what kind of length of time, what sort of interactions, which you've spoken about there, in terms of kind of frequency and depth. So it really looks at these sorts of things, and we make kind of some suggestions at the end that if you really want to change practice, i.e. improve practice, I guess, which is a contested term in and of itself, these are some of the issues which you really should be thinking about as you design your curricula.
And that takes me to kind of the closing question, which I think we've already got into a bit, but I'm going to enjoy asking you your own favorite question, Robyn, like the so what of the paper. Where does the real kind of impact of or value of this work lie?
My favorite answer. Once again, I guess, and you always try as a researcher not to make a decision like ahead of the context, but with this, it's yet again to actually think that there's a direct link between the personal and the structural. You cannot act and understand human action and the desire for change, the desire for alteration, unless you somehow have a decent understanding of the environment that they work in, I guess their identity, their history, why they want to do things. Are they able to do things? Do they have the space to do things? So it just emphasizes that this kind of hinge always exists between the individual and the structural for me. And unless that somehow, I get it, is better factored in to how we educate coaches, rather than, well, you can do this, this, and this, and this, and the other, then you're not going to have the alteration or the change that you're ultimately looking for.
And what's next then? Where does this work go next? I think you mentioned a book chapter as well.
It's to delve a little deeper. When you write an article as such, even though Manuel's work took 4 months and reams of data, you tried to squeeze all that into 8,000 words. And so really some of the issues, that we discussed here, we've gone a little bit further into the book chapter. Always the value of a book chapter, and I'm not sure, but maybe the editor of the book chapter is, of the book is listening. You're kind of allowed to fly a kite a little bit here, to be a bit more kind of speculative, So it's to kind of stretch a few of these inferences, a little bit more, particularly regarding a creativity. Mm-hmm. It is something that we would like, but we have to understand what it's for a bit more, and really kind of who's it for. Largely, I go to where I started with here, that we need to look at things with, you need to be like a stranger in your own home, as was said. You need to migrate. Your thought just needs to go somewhere else. You don't take orthodoxy for granted. This is what I think universities ought to be about, and in particular, how we should look at, learning in general, if that's with students or if it's with athletes, in order that we engage them to do a better job with whatever they want to do.
The only thing I'll add here, it's about thinking clearly about what is action research and how do we want to see action research moving forward, and this idea of action research being or we representing action research as a realistic, tangible design that we advocate for, even though we're critical, we advocate for. And I think one of the things that's on the what's next agenda, that I think actually it's on the three of us, it's on our agenda. It's about, bringing further clarity to action. What does it mean to do good action research? And how do we move beyond this oversimplified representation of AR?
And I think that goes straight back into some of the modules that you guys experienced, within your postgraduate education. Yeah, so this knowledge has already been, fed back in, and developed into the next iteration.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you've been the guinea pigs, and thanks very much for that.
And just finally then, before we end, Manuel, as you've been kind of avoiding questions, we have to ask you about your coaching rant. So what vexes you about coaching? Because I know you've been waiting a long time to chat about this.
I sat in the studio with Alex too many times listening to others ranting. So I really wanted to do mine. Now, in line of the main topic of our conversation here, I think my frustration is about this oversimplification of what being creative means. I received a recommendation of a podcast not long ago about creativity, where two academics were talking about creativity, and it really frustrated me about the oversimplified manner that they were dealing with it. And again, it was the think outside the box, the just have fun, the hands-off approaches, the type of preconceived ideas about what being creative means that they were being discussed. And it's an attempt to oversimplify what is very complex. And this is something that frustrates me. And in itself is very uncreative, that we keep repeating over and over again that creativity is this outside of the box thing. And we've heard that before. So we're talking about creativity in a very uncreative manner there are also things that adds very little value to the conversation about how can we become better thinking creatively.
Perfect. Great place to end. Thank you both for chatting on the podcast today. And thank you all for listening as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Al.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Cardiff Met Sports Coaching Hub podcast.
If you enjoyed the episode, leave us a rating and a review on your favourite podcast platform. If you're watching on YouTube, like and subscribe.
If you want to stay up to date with all of the latest work coming out of the Coaching Hub, please follow us on social media. All the relevant links are in the description.
And if you'd like to be featured in an upcoming listener special episode, drop us your questions to coachinghub@cardiffmet.ec.uk.